I love Underworld. I know it is kind of common to make fun of this franchise online, and to be honest, there is definitely a lot of material there. But I think also that there is actually a lot of great stuff in here that too often gets overlooked because it's hidden behind a layer of tight latex and early 2000s cheese. Like, there's no reason that a horror movie that relies on this level of CGI that was released in 2003 should be able to hold up this well. And that's because a lot of this isn't even CGI, as the main goal of the effects department in this film was that if it could be done physically in camera, it would be. It's goofy, sure, but I think there's a lot of fun stuff here mixed with some cool world-building ideas. Say what you will about it, but there was at least some thought and skill put into what's going on here. I have a lot of love and nostalgia for the time in the late 90s and early 2000s, where it could be justified to spend an absurd amount of money on an overly stylish horror film. As the horror boom was growing throughout the 80s, the genre began to, in certain cases, be taken more seriously as an art form, with larger budgeted projects being nominated alongside other, more traditional films, such as Bram Stoker's Dracula, Misery, Interview with the Vampire, and Silence of the Lambs. And as this continued, other blockbuster-style action horrors began to emerge through this time as well, to take advantage of emerging computer technologies. And I would wager that the period of roughly 1995 to 2005 saw on average more expensive horror movies being made than any other 10-year span so far in film history, once adjusted for inflation. Aeon Flux, Sleepy Hollow, Blade, Van Helsing, The Mummy, Sphere, Hollow Man, The Haunting, Event Horizon, Batman Returns, League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, The Relic, I Am Legend, and others come from a time where it was a legitimate possibility to throw superhero-level budgets at projects that would be considered fairly risky to finance, which is sadly something not done as often anymore. Most of these movies, admittedly, aren't great, but a lot of them are fun watches, and it's certainly an interesting time to look at that stands out in the horror landscape. And a post-Matrix world where this amount of money was regularly being spent on horror or horror-adjacent films, with also the previous year having Resident Evil as a massive financial hit, made for the perfect storm for something like Underworld to be created. And this movie definitely knows what it is. The filmmakers pretty much said, hey, let's make a new Matrix movie, but this time add in vampires and werewolves and substitute all the green for blue. It's probably the most shameless ripoff of the Matrix style that was ever made, and in this time there were a lot of them. The film series focuses on Selene, a death dealer vampire who fights for her coven against the Lycan clan in an eternal struggle for power that is unknown to the humans, who, oblivious to it all, continue to go about their day-to-day lives. In this universe, vampirism and lycanthropy are viruses that are transmitted by a bite, and both lines can trace back their origins to one Hungarian warlord from the 5th century, Alexander Corvinus. He was a rich nobleman and a military tactician, and one year a plague made its way through his country and killed almost all of its citizens. But his body had a rare genetic mutation, and in trying to fight the plague, his immune system overreacted, which resulted in him now being immortal. Here's where it gets kind of silly. So Alexander Corvinus had 3 sons, 2 of which, William and Marcus, directly inherited his immortality, and a third unnamed son that carried the recessive gene for immortality. One of the immortal sons, William, got bitten by a rabid wolf, which interacted with his immune system to create the lycanthropy virus. And the other immortal son, Marcus, got bitten by a rabid bat several years later, which created the vampirism variant of the immortal strain. William completely lost his sanity and his ability to turn back into a human, and roamed the countryside for years feasting on peasants and spreading the Lycan disease, turning it into an outright plague. Marcus, in response to this, bit a dying military genius named Victor to turn him immortal, in exchange for his expertise to help build an army of vampires to fight back against the spreading Lycan sickness. This is what kicks off a bloody war that has continued for centuries on into modern day, where our first film picks up. Also, it is important to note, instead of getting involved with the conflict directly with his sons, Alexander instead used his intelligence, wealth, and immortality to build his own army, with the sole purpose of keeping the vampire and Lycan war a secret from the humans, making sure that the world didn't fall apart from their endless battles, resulting in a modern world which very much resembles our own, where vampires and Lycans go freely on the street unnoticed. We get a feel for how this world is in the first scene that has some of the best establishing shots for any action horror of this time. Seeing Celine dressed all in black at night, perched on a building in the rain, stalking a man down on the streets, in a sequence that quickly turns into a massive gun battle, is just such a fun way to start all of this. And it lets you know immediately what you're getting yourself into. Everything in this film is over-the-top absurd style, and I love it. Every set looks expensive, every room is larger than life. There's a brief scene where Celine is doing some target practice at the gun range that they have set up in their mansion headquarters, and instead of paper targets, they're using marble busts. It's really goofy and treated with 100% sincerity, and I'm here for it. Nobody in this looks like they think that this is dumb, and it's the only reason that it works. The same could be said of the action as well. Over-the-top jumps, guns in almost every single shot, debris and shrapnel flying past the screen constantly, cool werewolf transitions, early 2000s CGI body zoom-ins that have not aged well, the famous shoot a hole in the floor by flinging bullets while spinning to escape werewolves like you're the tree in How the Grinch Stole Christmas moment. It's all great. The plot here also, while kind of cliched and not extraordinarily unique, serves as a vehicle to get us from set piece to set piece, each filled with as much bloody action violence as they could get away with. And that can largely be said for every movie in this series. The story here deals with Lucien, the head of the Lycans who is working in the shadows secretly with one of the head vampires, Craven, to develop a mysterious weapon that could end the war. And most of the first half follows Celine as she hunts for clues to uncover this mystery, disobeying orders given directly by Craven, who instructs her specifically not to investigate. But as she dives deeper into this conspiracy, it is revealed that Lucien and Craven have been searching for the direct descendants of the third unnamed son of Alexander Corvinus, who, theoretically, would still be carrying the uncorrupted recessive genes within their body to immortality, in the hopes of creating a hybrid half-breed mix of vampire and Lycan, which would merge the two bloodlines into one super monster, ending the conflict by blurring the lines of what the two sides represent. So while this is very much your basic tropey monster storytelling stuff that you can find just about anywhere, what really makes this function is the tone and style that it is presented in. And what I really admire about Underworld is how that tone and style was crafted almost entirely by hand. This is definitely a movie made out of love, and that is on display in every scene here. There's a moment that caught my attention in the behind-the-scenes features, where the producer of the film, Richard Wright, says, "We made a movie that we would go see ourselves," which I think is great, and is a tangible presence that you can feel while you watch it. Because all too often I think people create things that they themselves would never spend money to go see, leading to a lot of bland art on the market out there. And I love to see creators say to themselves, yeah, this is kind of dumb, but we wanted to make it and we had a lot of fun doing it. I think there's something to be said for that. The Lycans in this movie are all massive Jabba the Hutt style puppets that require 4 people at once to operate. And there are a lot of instances where you have more than one of these on screen at any given time. And the coordination and effort it would have taken to have 2 different teams of puppeteers operating 2 different werewolves who are interacting with one another and have it be convincing is kind of crazy to me. The main performers in the suits moving the arms and legs were standing on carbon fiber stilts made specifically to fit their own body. And because of the werewolf heads, they were completely blind the whole time, taking their direction from one of the other puppeteers who talked to them through an earpiece. Kate Beckinsale said on playing the role of Celine that, "I don't think that there are that many kind of great action movie roles for women. You know, they are usually the wife who is at home worrying on the phone. That's not ever been that interesting to me. The other thing about action movies with female leads is that they can be quite camp and winky. What really appealed to me about this is that it just could have been a guy, and I thought that was really fresh and interesting, and then I had to pull it off. Almost all of the stunts and fights here she did herself. The iconic opening sequence where Celine jumps from the tower onto the street was originally supposed to be filmed on a much shorter building, about 50 feet tall. But for a number of different reasons, they had to change to the building used in the film that is over 100 feet tall. And Beckinsale and a combination of different stunt performers together had to do this jump multiple times to get it right. There's just a lot of cool stuff here in my opinion that they had to do because they wanted to keep as many of the effects as real as they conceivably could. Also, I do want to say that I'm not trying to pretend that these are great works in the history of cinema. I know exactly what these are. They are the Fast and Furious version of a horror movie. But I think that anything can and should be critiqued on a basic storytelling, craft, and writing level. And the sheer fact of the situation is that almost everything this movie attempts to pull off, it succeeds in. Someone might not like the style of it, but you can at least admit that it picks a distinctive tone and adheres to that in a really strong way. Aside from the obvious things that are easy to poke fun at, there are some issues that I have with the first film that I would like to address here. Firstly, I wish the vampires were more physically intimidating. They can obviously jump very high and survive falls from great distances with no problems, and heal wounds very quickly. But they never really get to engage in full physical hand-to-hand combat, almost always relying on guns to do the job for them. And I would have liked to have seen a bit more of gun-based martial arts combination on display, that includes kicks, punches, and slashes in with the shooting. The most we ever really get of that is Victor throwing Michael through a wall and the fight that follows that. But that's only a few moments at the end, and it would have been great to see more of this going on throughout the whole film. The other main issue that I have with this movie is that for as R-rated as most of the content is, there's a strong lack of any sexual material. Aside from things like succubi and sirens, vampires are kind of the horny monsters. Their whole thing is attacking you in one of the most sensual and vulnerable parts of your body, and using their sexual allure to get the best of you. And a big tradition with the vampire story is to examine sexual themes through them. But aside from the tight black latex Matrix-inspired outfits, these vampires are essentially sexless, which neuters a lot of the storytelling potential that these creatures were initially designed for. I understand that they are very much trying to do their own thing here through the vampire, and I like that. But the traditionalist in me would have loved to have seen them be at least a little more playful in this regard, as without it they don't really feel all the way like vampires to me. In fact, these creatures don't really drink blood in this movie to survive at all, which is kind of a shame. We are told they do, but we don't ever really get to see that except for a few wine glasses filled with blood that characters hold in some scenes. The film takes place over a very short period of time, and none of our characters have to feed in that period. In fact, the only instance we see them drinking blood from another creature is from each other for healing purposes. Most of the time, they feel more in line with superhumans rather than the night-stalking creatures who dine on the innocent. And if it weren't for this flashback near the end of the film, and a special type of bullet used only once, we would not even know that sunlight kills or harms them. And it's stuff like this on both the vampire and werewolf side of the narrative that I think they could have focused a bit more on. But the movie was already a little over 2 hours in runtime, so I get it. It just wasn't something they were wanting to explore, choosing to focus more on the vampire-werewolf conflict, rather than the specific things that these two species have to do to survive. That being said, I think that could have used some work as well. It isn't super clear in this first movie why these two factions are fighting, and why the conflict has waged on for so long. And I know the later films flesh this out more. But any film, especially the first in a series, needs to be able to stand on its own as well as stand in relation to those it is related to. I think some of the time spent on Celine trying to solve the mystery in the first half of the film could have been better devoted to letting us understand more about this world and how it operates. Not saying I don't like it, but there is definitely a lot of weak points that could have used more refining. And overall, it makes for at least a memorable and original action horror film that created a world that could be explored in further entries of the franchise. And it is here that we should talk about the allegations of plagiarism that have been placed against the creators of the Underworld series. As on September 3rd, 2003, less than a month before the film was released, White Wolf Publishing and Nancy Collins sued Sony Pictures for infringing on their copyright over the role-playing games Werewolf the Apocalypse and Vampire the Masquerade, as well as Collins' novels set within those universes, citing 80 different similarities between the film Underworld and their property. The case was only open for 4 days, and in private the two parties settled for an unknown sum on September 7th. And I don't know if they even should have settled, but Sony probably wanted the story out of the headlines as fast as possible before the film's release, and so they just paid them off to make it happen. Because to be honest, vampires and werewolves are such old monsters dating back in their origins to folklore that have been used for so many things, and hybrid creatures are featured in so many monster stories, that I don't really know if you can argue plagiarism for having them fight each other or fall in love with each other. If you break Underworld down to its most basic level, it is a retelling of Romeo and Juliet. Except instead of rival families, it is just werewolves and vampires. To be fair, I've not read Colin's books, and I don't know a whole lot about these fictional universes. But what is going on in Underworld is pretty on par for what you will find in a lot of vampire and werewolf stories if you strip away the fashion and gunplay. This may be controversial to say, but I'm of the opinion that if you're working with these monsters, then you don't really ever have the right to claim copyright violation in almost any case. Because you could almost definitely find multiple examples of what you are claiming in other different stories that feature those same monsters. The similarities, I think, would have to be very egregious to warrant that. They are just tales constructed around very specific tropes that have been around for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And that is the reality of the situation. They are told very differently, but one could argue that Twilight and Underworld have a ton of similarities, some even glaringly so. I mean, they even both have Michael Sheen playing the head of one of the rival factions. And I don't think the Underworld creators would have a strong ground to sue them either. So I'm definitely not the person to ask in this situation, but from what I can tell, it seems like they didn't have much of a case. The other, more serious example of plagiarism on display here is actually one that never went to court, in that Kate Beckinsale's character Selene is literally just Selene from Marvel Comics. They didn't even change her name. Her powers are obviously different, but not by much. In the Marvel Universe, Selene is a mutant who is able to drain another's life force to extend her own, making her in her own way a type of vampire. Visually, they just took this character and essentially made a fanfiction world based around her. And I don't know how they got out of this without being sued, but somehow they did. The film was then followed up with a PS2 video game, and if I'm being honest, I'm not gonna play this. By all accounts, it wasn't very good even by the standards of 2004, and isn't required to understand the story of the series. In fact, there isn't really a story here at all from what I can tell, only the bare minimum to justify the gameplay. And speaking of Underworld tie-in media, around this same time, the first comic set in this universe would come out that is just a shot-for-shot remake of the first movie. Out of the 5 Underworld comics that have so far been made up to today, only one of them is not an adaptation of one of the films. That one being Red in Tooth and Claw, which tells the story of how Reyes went from being a human to becoming infected with the Lycan virus, and ascending through the ranks to become the right-hand man of Lucian. And that one isn't even considered to be canon anymore. That being said though, the art in all of these series is pretty good and fits the tone of this world, so at least there's that. There have also been 4 novels set within this universe, 3 of which are just novelizations of the first 3 movies. The 4th being a prequel to the first film that is no longer canon for the same reason, because the 3rd film, Rise of the Lycans, is also a prequel that constantly contradicts this book and that comic. And this is kind of sad to me, because if there were ever horror film franchises that were ripe with potential to be fleshed out in expansion side media, this is certainly one of them. There's actually a lot of lore and mythology baked into the backgrounds of these movies that never really gets a chance to shine, because they are trying to tell a complicated story within a reasonable amount of time. And if it were conceived today, I imagine that they would have attempted to make Underworld into a television show instead. There are so many things that could be explored through comics and novels that the films haven't touched on, and so it's a bit disappointing to see pretty much every piece of Underworld media outside of the movies just rehashing the plots of films that already exist. Even Red in Tooth and Claw is centered around one of the scenes from the first movie when Reyes gets killed, where we see his life flash before his eyes as a framing device. And I think it would have just been nice if this effort had been used to tell other, more original stories set within this universe, fully untethered from the films themselves. Unfortunately, the next film to come out, 2006's Underworld Evolution, would act as a bit of a soft refresh of the series, and would largely ignore what that first film set up. This is immediately evident in the opening scene in which, hundreds of years ago, the vampiric coven, clad in armor and arriving on horseback, discover a village that has been infected with the Lycan virus. The vampire elders, Marcus, Victor, and Amelia, are present in this scene, despite the fact that the entire plot of the previous film is focused on the idea that it is tradition for only one elder to be awake at any given time, while the other 2 rest because of their immense age. We learn more about this process and tradition in the next film, but when watching them in order, it feels like a continuity break. But also, I'm really okay with the changes that are made because they are in service of adding more fun and tension to the individual movie. I normally would want to see tighter continuity and attention paid to details, but with something like this, it's kind of easy to let it slide. And these changes do make for an overall better experience than what was offered the first time around. There's a lot of martial art, hand-to-hand style combat going on here now, which fits the tone that the series is going for much better. The horror is also significantly stronger this time around, with the main antagonist, Marcus, being an incredibly intimidating creature who flies with giant bat wings that he can use to impale his victims. The story is even more interesting, I think, most of the time, and in general, a great deal of the things attempted here are even more successful than the series' first outing. But as I said, this is very much a soft reboot of the franchise. The basic lore is more or less the same. The history that we learned has not been changed all that much. But one of the first scenes here is the secondary villain from the previous film, Craven, being killed with the entirety of the rest of the Vampire Coven by Marcus, who was awakened by Selene in the last moments of the previous entry. Him killing every character that we had known and been introduced to really wipes the slate clean, and from here on it very much becomes a Selene versus Marcus story with little reliance on the outside world building set up in the first film, aside from an appearance of the man who created both lines of monsters, Alexander Corvinus. The story here relates back to the earliest Lycans that were first born, feral and unable to revert back to their human form. Marcus's identical brother William was the first of the Lycans, and was seen as such a threat that a special prison was built for him by the vampires, so that he could no longer spread the virus that was created within him. He has since been encased within that tomb, and now that Marcus has been awakened, he makes it his mission to free his brother, who he feels was unfairly imprisoned. He claims his goal was to eliminate the spread of lycanthropy, but never wanted to see his brother put away like that. Victor was the one who thought there was no other way to handle the situation, and Marcus could not disagree because the army was loyal to Victor, even though he himself was the original vampire, and insubordination to Victor would result in his death. But since Selene killed Victor in the last film, Marcus now feels free to pursue liberating William from his cell, and Selene views it as her obligation to stop him, to prevent a new lycanthropy outbreak from happening. All in all, I really like most of the decisions that this movie makes, and I think it is probably the high point of the franchise. Everything about this is bigger and better than the last movie. It's really convoluted still, and at times hard to follow, but that is a complaint that could be leveled against most of these types of films. And at this point, it has generally become a feature of the subgenre of overly expensive, flashy horror action. Really though, I think a major improvement from last time was deciding to have Marcus as the main threat. He actually feels like an ancient vampire monster in the way that Victor never really did. I love Bill Nye, but he just wasn't given a ton to work with there in my opinion, something that the third film would attempt to make up for. It is really weird though in this one that they build up Marcus as a giant threat in scene after scene for the first 2 acts, only to trap him behind a stone wall for most of the climax. Based on what we have seen from him earlier in the story, he should absolutely be able to burst through this with no problem. He is shown to have incredible strength, and tearing this down shouldn't be an issue for him. It's actually quite funny at times unintentionally, because for what seems like 10 or so minutes they are fighting William and the fresh Lycans that he has created, and it just keeps cutting back to a frustrated Marcus slapping his palms on the wall trying to get out. He was used in a very effective and menacing way for the entirety of the beginning of the film, and it's a shame that they locked him away as soon as William was freed, because it would have provided a good opportunity to show off Selene's new abilities that she inherits from the dying Alexander Corvinus by drinking his blood a few scenes previously. They make a really big deal of Selene now having these newfound powers that he gives her, but in this fight she kinda seems the same as she has the whole time, like she's on the same power level that she was before, and they instead could have used these two characters to demonstrate that change within her in a really cool way. This could have been a great opportunity to demonstrate her power escalation that they didn't go for, which I find odd. And then when Marcus is finally freed, he is quickly brained with a part of his own wing that she rips off of him, and then kicked into some helicopter propellers and dies. And it just seems that this fight could have had a bit more thought put into the choreography and meaning behind what was happening, because it is over much too quickly for how much he is feared and built up in the other scenes in the film. That isn't to say that I hate this ending though. In fact, I think William is probably the most well-done Lycan in the series, and there's a lot of fun to be had here if you don't think too hard about it, which I guess is the mantra of a lot of the stuff going on in this franchise. It seems like the filmmakers also agreed that William was the best looking Lycan they had created so far, as they dyed his fur black and reused his costume for a lot of the close-up shots in the next film, 2009's prequel, Underworld: Rise of the Lycans. This would be the first film in the series not directed by Len Wiseman, instead being replaced by Patrick Tatopoulos, that you might recognize from Sci-Fi's Face Off. And I go out of my way to mention this not because the change in style is particularly noticeable, but because this guy has built an entire career on being involved in this subgenre, and it's really cool to see. He has worked on Spawn, Godzilla, Pitch Black, Battlefield Earth, Van Helsing, iRobot, Alien vs. Predator, Silent Hill, Resident Evil Extinction, I Am Legend, Knowing, 2012, and the sequels to a lot of those, to name just a few. I just like knowing that there's a go-to guy out there to get if you want to make this kind of movie. What's interesting to note here is that this film wasn't made because Beckinsale didn't want to come back. In fact, Evolution and Rise of the Lycans were both greenlit at the same time based on the success of the first film. And so it was done for more of a purposeful narrative reason, rather than a losing their main star kind of reason. And I like to see bold decisions like that being made, because Rise of the Lycans is a bold movie. It is pretty rare for a franchise to decide to make a film set in a totally different time period and have it be focused almost entirely on building up the lore of the series, and it's great to see that happening here. This tells the story of Victor, who has already risen to great power, running a castle of vampires in the midst of his crusade to rid the land of the roving packs of mindless werewolves that were created by William. But this isn't going very well for him. The numbers of the beasts continue to grow every day, and his men are frequently ambushed on the roads while hunting them. The human kingdoms who neighbor his people have decided to stop paying him for protection because they appear to be losing more battles than they win. It isn't explicitly told how this happens, but somehow in Victor's dungeon, a new kind of creature is created. A werewolf who is able to revert back to human form, and is able to reason and think and keep most of their humanity intact, unlike the giant wolves that they are engaged in a constant war with. Victor names this one Lucian, and uses him to breed a new race that he calls the Lycans, to aid him in battling the other, more primitive beasts. And it is through this that our view of the Lycan and vampire conflict, that we have seen in 2 films now, gets changed and reshaped. This is definitely a narrative about slavery. The Lycans all wear spiked collars, are forced into hard labor, and live in small and cramped quarters with their wrists and ankles shackled. When they do not follow direct orders, they are beaten, whipped, or even killed. And one thing that I find interesting about this is that the film is definitely presenting the Lycans as the sympathetic victims of oppression, who are seeking liberation from the vampires. It's what the whole film is about. It is the only film in the series from their perspective. We get to know them as people and see them as being capable of real emotions and feelings, rather than the cold shells that the vampires have become. But in the other films, we see them as monsters primarily from the vampire perspective, that are presented as an absolute evil which must be destroyed lest the world fall to pieces. And getting to know them here as something totally in conflict with what we have been told about them retextualizes what we saw in those films to be even more despicable and genocidal than we were initially led to believe. Because of Rise of the Lycans, every other one of these films are reshaped as stories about people in power who act in oppressive ways over another, less fortunate group, committing horrible acts to retain that power. The conflict may have started as a justified war against mindless beasts, but at this point it no longer is about that, and the narrative becomes a tale of how violence begets violence until the cycle is ended, and of people fighting to retain their right to own other people. This changes how we feel about these characters and their motivations and actions every time we see them from here on. And I think that change in perspective is a pretty cool thing to attempt. One thing though that I'm not very huge on is that thematically it is very similar to what we've already seen within the first films. Beneath the vampire and Lycan war, we are given another Romeo and Juliet story between Lucian and Victor's daughter Sonia, and through that coupling she becomes pregnant, and we have another take on the concept of a hybrid unifying the bloodlines of the two races. And through this, they may be trying to make a commentary about how all problems across all of history and time are similar in nature, and how we are doomed to repeat the same battles and mistakes over and over again until we learn from them. But some more story variation may have been nice to see as well. I absolutely love the setting here, and I think it is really cool to do a whole movie about a kingdom of Middle Ages vampires. It's like they took the opening of Evolution and made a whole movie set around it, but unfortunately there's very little that this film does better than that opening scene did with this setting. One of my favorite ideas in all of media is the cultivated humans that are used near the climax of the Beasts of May's Castle arc in Yu Yu Hakusho. In order for a society of vampires to exist, they realistically would need to build farms where they grew and harvested humans similar to what we do with animals. And to have an entire kingdom here of vampires with no actual in-universe explanation of how they survive is a little disappointing. Especially considering the major theme of slavery and consuming others being used here. We see them drinking with goblets filled with blood at times throughout the film, and one can infer that a human farm might be what sustains this. But I would have liked to have seen it push boundaries there with how morbid a primitive society of vampires would actually be to function properly. Because the logistics of more than just a few vampires coexisting in the same general area becomes pretty grim when you actually put some thought into how that would have to work. And I would have liked to have seen that explored more here, if only in a few scenes, but sadly it is glanced over. There are a few moments, however, that hint at what this society would really be like in real life, such as the walls made out of human skulls and bones. These bits are great and really add much needed texture to the film. And I think if they were going to make a medieval vampire supremacy film, they should have just gone all in on that aesthetic. It would have made for a stronger overall experience, but what is presented here is still good and well done. It just could have been more enriched into the grain of the film, in my opinion. Because if you were to say to me the words Society of Middle Ages Vampires, my mind immediately goes to weird masquerade castle sex parties with fountains pumping blood. But that's not what this is. That isn't a bad thing though. It's just two different interpretations on the idea of what this would have looked like in real life. But ultimately, the real reason why any of us are here is to watch vampires fight werewolves with swords, which we get plenty of. The action here is just as good as it was in the previous films, although there is less of it on display, probably as a result of the realities associated with the cost of making a period piece like this. There just isn't a lot of money to put into crazy stunts when you have to rent giant castles and create a lot of costume armor for actors to wear. But there are some real standout moments here, such as the Lycan prison escape sequence, where the vampires are shooting massive arrows through the walls like they're the giant in Dark Souls 3. And the climax has some really great bits in it. One thing I will say though is that this is very, very dark in a visual sense. The other films all take place at night as well, but you can clearly see what is going on in them. But parts of this look like the Battle of Winterfell, which honestly was probably done to hide some of the not great CGI, as there are a lot of Lycans on screen at once in this section, more than there are at any other point in the series. It may sound like I'm being pretty hard on this entry, but ultimately it is still a lot of fun and shows how versatile this universe is capable of being. The idea of what Underworld can be is very malleable, and I love that this goes for a very out there idea and mostly pulls it off well. It makes me sad when watching this that they didn't go weird with the next one and have it be a future punk setting or something like that. I think if they had the money, it could have been done really well. I mean, the next film entry starts with Celine breaking out of a human prison that she's being held in. And because all of the characters are immortal, they really could have gone weird with it and had her break out 200 years from now or something like that. And not much would have changed with the narrative except for now having an upgrade in style. The Underworld aesthetic, I think, would look really good through a neon-soaked futuristic lens, and I wish they would have gone for that. And I think at this point, we should intercut with a list of insane crossovers that almost happened that sadly never did. The first of which was that Underworld 4 and Blade 4 were at one point going to be the same film, which would have been perfect. Stylistically, it would have made absolute sense, but also considering that Celine is basically a ripped-off Marvel character, there would have been a lot that they could do there. But seeing as at this point Marvel Studios were in the early process of acquiring the rights to Blade to incorporate him into the MCU, this never came to be. Another spin-off that almost happened that I think made even more sense was at one point it was considered merging the Underworld films and the Resident Evil films into a mega franchise. It would have been fairly easy to do. Both were properties of Screen Gems, and stylistically they were kind of like sister franchises to one another. It also helped that Paul W.S. Anderson, who wrote and directed most of the Resident Evil films, already had previous experience with merging franchises with Alien vs. Predator in 2004. But his experience with AVP was actually what appears to be the main deciding factor in an Underworld Resident Evil film never being made. When asked about the possibility of merging the two properties at the 2012 San Diego Comic-Con, he said, "My aim when I made Alien vs. Predator was hopefully I was going to take two moribund franchises and not only make a successful film, but re-energize those franchises. I always said when I made that movie that the thing that would make me happiest as a fanboy would be to see another Predator movie and to see another Alien movie, and that came to pass. At the time when I made AVP, it was not seen as a slam dunk movie, that's for sure. The previous Alien movie and the last Predator movie were seen as real disappointments, so I think AVP kind of did re-energize everything. In the Underworld and Resident Evil world, both of those franchises are quite vibrant and healthy, so the idea of a crossover is probably too premature. Which, I get what he's trying to say here. And maybe this is just hindsight talking, but I don't think that it would be very fair to call either of these franchises healthy in 2012. They both would receive only one more film each, both of which would be the lowest performing of their franchises at the domestic box office. And if there was one thing that could have revitalized public interest in these two series that already felt dated by the end of the 2000s, it would have been a crazy move like this. I think the only way to have kept doing a crazy series like this is to just gradually ramp up the crazy in unexpected and creative ways over time. And this was absolutely the move they should have taken in my opinion if they wanted to continue making these. He also said that he didn't think that it would have been as easy as it seemed to merge the two, because even though they were both Sony film properties, he expected that Capcom, who created the original video game series, would have stepped in to stop it from happening. Which, he obviously would know better than I would, but the amount of pure lunacy clown stuff that they were able to get away with in these movies that was totally different from anything that appeared in the games makes it seem like Capcom didn't really care what they did with the films. I'm actually shocked that Capcom didn't move in and put an end to the films after the first few, because everyone I know that isn't involved in video game culture associates the Resident Evil brand name with trashy 2000s action films. But they let these movies go on like this for 15 years, and I think if the filmmakers really wanted to, they could have probably made this crossover happen. The third crossover that almost happened probably to them seemed the most natural, but is also the one that I'm most happy didn't go through. Underworld is a concept conceived by three people: director and husband to Kate Beckinsale, Len Wiseman, stuntman and screenwriter Danny McBride, who appears in the first film as Mason, and actor, screenwriter, and comic book writer Kevin Gravois, who appears as Reyes in two of the films. I think Kevin Gravois is really cool, and he gives one of the most memorable performances in any of these movies. Just what he's able to do with his voice alone makes him immediately stand out as a great action character. But in 2014, the adaptation of his comic I, Frankenstein was released, and there's not really anything enjoyable here for me. I don't know exactly why, because tonally it isn't all that different from what you can find in Underworld, but this one for me personally is just bad, and not bad in an overly fun way like the Underworld movies are. But the original intent was for this to be the first film in a new franchise set within the Underworld universe. There are even rumors that Kate Beckinsale possibly filmed a secret cameo as Celine for this, that eventually was cut from the final product. That scene is at least in the first few drafts of the script. They also cut out any references to the greater Underworld mythos that originally appeared in the story. And this is probably the right call, as anything like this would have probably been confusing to anyone who had gone to see this in theaters that didn't know anything about Underworld. Not to mention the fact that Bill Nye plays the villain in this, which doesn't make any sense considering his prominent role in the Underworld franchise. I, Frankenstein went on to fail at the box office, and it was probably for the best that it remained its own separate thing. The franchise would actually make its next appearance as a short animated film, Endless War, in 2011, that was created to promote the next major release in the series, 2012's Underworld Awakening. This short is good, but there isn't enough here to really say anything about it. And I think more money should have been placed into this because it is only 18 minutes long, and there just isn't a lot you can do in that time. It actually reminds me of a similar thing that Blade Runner 2049 did with its release, which also, while cool, didn't have enough resources to really do much other than I guess its intended purpose of advertising the main film. The beginning of this opens by mirroring the first film with Celine perched atop a tower, stalking a lichen on the streets below. Only this time we are in Paris, and it is the 1800s. And this serves as a nice way to ease us into this new setting through familiar means. That doesn't go a long way though, because this section is only 5 minutes long. Celine gets a contract to kill 3 lichen brothers, she kills one, and the other 2 escape, vowing revenge on her, and that's it. Like I said, just not a ton of time to develop anything much, but it's fun for what it is. We then cut to 1967 and this intro is flipped on its head in a really unexpected way, where one of the lichen brothers is on top of a tower watching Celine, who is unaware of his presence. The way that they explain this is very funny to me, because in order to mask their scent so that she won't detect them, the 2 brothers open up a head shop and constantly hang out with hippies so that they always smell like weed smoke and not like werewolves. I don't know, I just think that they could have come up with something better here if they tried harder. The lichens then attack a group of Parisian vampires with a solar flare bomb, vaporizing them instantly. And this is very great, and more stuff like this needs to happen in these movies. Because so far we've only really had one type of thing like this, and I think creative weapons need to be more of a feature of these stories. There's a moment in the last film, Blood Wars, where the lichens shoot a similar device out of a cannon at a group of vampires. And when I saw this, I got so excited, because I thought we were actually going to see the flare bomb in a live-action film. But all the cannon did was shoot large projectiles through the wall that killed the vampires by letting sunlight in. Still cool, but not as good as a flare bomb would have been. And for a series that is based almost entirely around vampire and werewolf gunplay, they didn't do a whole lot to build a great repertoire of over-the-top creative weapons that are steeped in the historical lore of these monsters. And because of this, the films aren't quite as good as they could have been, I think. Anyways, back to this. Celine then interrupts their attack, cuts one of the brothers' heads off, and slices an arm off the other, who narrowly escapes into the woods to heal and plot his revenge. We then cut to some time in the near future after the events of Evolution, and we are given a hint of what we might find in the next film, as the story begins with armed humans searching cars, looking for lichens or vampires after learning of their existence. Celine and the hybrid creature Michael have tracked the last brother to a hotel in Paris to ambush him. But he is suddenly defended by an army of topless machine gun wielding prostitutes that allow him to escape. I don't know what these people are doing here, and it is very weird and comes out of nowhere. But after dealing with them, Michael throws him out of a window and Celine gives the finishing kill. Before he dies, the last brother gives a prophetic warning that they will be the hunted now, that the humans are aware of their existence. Which leads us directly into 2012's Underworld Awakening. The opening to this is definitely a ripoff of Zack Snyder's amazing intro to his 2004 Dawn of the Dead, where we watch clips from the news intercut with humans fighting lichens and vampires in the streets, all set to music. But that isn't a bad thing, because while it's not nearly as good, it still works and is efficient in catching us up to speed on the events that transpire between Evolution and Awakening. And it sets the stage for this film well. The basic idea is that the humans have learned about the 2 races, and are waging an all-out assault on them, trying to purge both types of monsters from existence, as they see them as an existential threat to humanity. This transitions into a SWAT assault on Celine, and for the first time here, I think the series delivers on what I expect when I think of the idea of a vampire action movie. Because now she is throwing people through the air with her immense strength, and performing actions that I would more commonly associate with vampires than what has been on display in the previous films. She actually even bites people's necks here. And it's kinda crazy to me that it took all the way up to movie 4 to get this right, but I'm glad they eventually got there. After being captured, Celine is held in cryosleep for 12 years, and the story picks up as she is being woken mysteriously and now has to make it in this world where vampires and werewolves have been hunted to the brink of extinction. This first scene was actually originally intended to mirror the opening of Resident Evil Apocalypse, and act as a callback to that film, where Celine would have escaped in a medical gown similar to how Alice does in that movie, but for some reason this idea was scrapped during production. She would have only worn the iconic black outfit for the first scene of the movie, and then again at the end when she would have found it in a room deep in the facility. And I actually love this idea and hate that they didn't do it, because it would have been an excellent visual metaphor of how out of her element Celine feels here. And I love when you can showcase a character's emotional state through their visual character design. Everyone remembers how weird Jules and Vincent look in Jimmy's clothes, or how strange Guts looks in his formal wear at the ball that is celebrating the Band of the Hawk. And that is because they are first introduced in a very memorable outfit that they are obviously comfortable in, only to then be placed in a situation that is uncomfortable for them, that is reflected in what they are wearing. And I just wish that more things did that, and it could have been done really well here in Underworld Awakening, because her outfit is so well recognized even by people who haven't seen these movies. But stuff like this can probably be attributed to the fact that this movie had 6 different versions scripted by 6 different screenwriters. And when they started filming, they didn't even know which version of the script was going to be the finalized one that they went with. So by all accounts, this was a very chaotic film to work on. And they probably didn't want to commit to an idea like that if it wouldn't make sense in the context of what they would eventually be shooting, and can be the main explanation of why most of what is on display here is the way that it is. This movie usually is referred to as when the series started to go bad, but I think rather it is more so the beginning of a tonal shift than anything else. And there's still a lot of great world building and action here that makes up for some of the other stuff that isn't as good. Like this quick 10-second scene where Celine escapes through an army surplus store. There's a quick cutaway shot to a counter with jars selling lichen and vampire teeth, along with silver bullets and knives. And small textural details like this are really nice, and hint to how a large part of the society views this conflict. The lichens that appear in this film are also much smaller, and more skeletal in design than they have been in previous entries, which alludes to them having to hide more than they once did, having less access to food. Although to pull this off, they had to switch their designs to being fully CGI creations for most of the time that they are on screen, to mixed results. But some of the time, they were still done practically on set, like in the previous movies, and those still look really great. So even though the movie isn't well loved, I actually kind of have a fond place for it. The story here is also the only time in the series that the events are not overly convoluted, which I think was a good move. In fact, the plot is pretty basic in its structure, and the fun comes from the sheer amount of action and carnage that is presented, which is more extreme than any other entry of the series, which is what makes it possibly my favorite Underworld movie. The story really is just them getting captured, then escaping, then seeking revenge. And that is pretty much it. But Celine easily kills at least 100 people in this movie, and I think that other Underworld titles should shoot more for this type of tone with over-the-top, non-stop violence with a story that doesn't take too much of the focus away. The twist of the movie is pretty dumb, but also I think it doesn't seem unreasonable within the logic of the writing with this universe, as it is revealed that the real reason that Celine, Michael, and their daughter were captured at the beginning of the film and held in stasis rather than being killed is because the people in the top position of the government's science divisions are actually all lichens, who were trying to study the hybrids to figure out how to create a vaccine to make them immune to being poisoned by silver, and that the purges of both races was a massive cover-up operation to hide their real intent. But even though what is being told here narratively is more simple, the hallmark silliness that is treated with absolute sincerity remains intact, and I like to see that, as I really think that it's the only reason that these work the way they do. You have a decadent chandelier that, when lowered, doubles as a fancy gun cabinet. Theo James doing martial arts against werewolves with shurikens and a silver whip. Kate Beckinsale shooting her guns at a falling elevator above her head, so the floor breaks apart just in time for her to not get smashed. And a giant werewolf the size of a Lord of the Rings troll. The lead up to the giant lichen fight is also really solid and tense, where you see it skulking in the background as light flickers casting its massive shadow against the curtains. But the effects on him and the ensuing fight feels a little dated for 2012, and because of the limited budget, a lot of the fight feels unfortunately slow moving, lacking that kinetic energy you would want from a fight like this. But the rest of the final battle is pretty fun, and literally as soon as it's over, the credits begin to roll. This knows what it is and doesn't waste your time pretending to be something other than that, and I have to respect it on that level. Over the next few years, it seems as if the people behind the series didn't know what direction to take the franchise in. In 2014, The Hollywood Reporter ran a story saying that Corey Goodman, writer of Priest and The Last Witch Hunter, had been hired to oversee a reboot of the franchise. A month later, it was revealed that the film would serve both as a reboot and sequel to the previous films, focusing primarily on Theo James's character from Awakening, and that Beckinsale would not appear in this film at all. Then another month passed, and it was finally revealed that Beckinsale would in fact be returning to star in a new entry titled Blood Wars, and that this would not serve as a reboot, but instead a traditional sequel. It is clear from these events, I feel, that she didn't want to do this movie, and it unfortunately shows. This is a series that, by this point, is known for its big opening set pieces, but this one doesn't work very well in my opinion. We start with a few quick shots of a motorcycle chase that is over in about 15 seconds. And then when backed into a corner, Celine just stands there and lets herself be harpooned by lichens. Then she is pulled to the ground and beaten, and then managing to eventually get back up, she fights off a few of them before David drives in and saves her life. Which is not a good look for the series in my opinion, and is pretty against how this character should be portrayed. In fact, there's a lot of Celine getting easily beaten by men and Celine getting saved by David in this movie. And she doesn't even get to really fight in the final battle between the lichens and vampires until it's almost over, because she's taking a spiritual nap while it's happening. I don't particularly care for any of this, as it very much goes against the nature of the series, with how strong and proactive her character is supposed to be. She doesn't even find the strength to beat the final lichen boss until she internally reflects on the love that Michael had for her, which makes her stronger, and she generally isn't allowed to stand for herself as a character very much in this entry. And if this ends up being the last Underworld film, then that's very sad to me. And this can unfortunately be said about a lot of things in this movie, as it constantly contradicts other tonal, factual, and thematic aspects that we have been shown in previous entries. The very next scene, Samira and Thomas talk about needing to prepare against an attack by the new Lichen leader, Marius, saying that there has never in history been a large-scale Lichen assault like this, and that they don't know how to prepare for it. But the entirety of the first film and the climax of the third film is about a large-scale Lichen attack. Not to mention that a significant portion of the government in the last movie was a secret conspiracy organized by Lichens to wipe out the vampires, which just feels weird to not acknowledge here. By this point, this movie is only made for people who enjoyed the previous films. You're not going to get anybody new with Underworld 5. So to ignore continuity and character writing that has been pretty consistent up until this point is very strange. We don't get a great explanation here as to how the Lichens have regrouped and built back their numbers again following the purge that we saw at the beginning of Awakening. We also don't get to learn why they are no longer in control of the government's science divisions. We don't learn why there are still massive vampire covens operating after most of their numbers were wiped out in that time as well. In Awakening, Thomas is living in an underground cave, but here the vampires are in nice fancy mansions again, with large outdoor garden parties, with no in-universe logic as to how this came about, and how they are again able to live in secret on the surface without the humans being aware. There actually are no humans in this movie at all, except for one scene where they quickly walk through a train station. Everyone else in this is either Lichen or vampire, and that is a very weird creative decision I think, considering the events of the last movie and the implications that should have had for this one. It's almost as if Awakening didn't even happen, as this feels more like a sequel to Evolution rather than anything else. The fun of franchise filmmaking is taking what someone before you previously established and asking yourself what happens next, and building on the foundation that was left for you. And anytime you have a situation like this, where that foundation is completely ignored, to tell a story that also ends up being worse than one would have been had it followed that logical path is disappointing. The plot of this film weirdly feels in the first half kind of Hunger Games inspired, with a lot of Game of Thrones imagery in the second half. It is your usual Lichens gathering for an attack, and the vampires preparing to defend themselves that we're used to with this series by now. But a large portion of this film is spent on the preparation for the battle, with Celine training a new generation of Death Dealer vampires. And these sets that they use where the new recruits are getting ready for battle under her supervision feel like they are lifted entirely from that franchise. And I find this interesting to watch, because as the Underworld series progresses, they borrow significantly from different things that are popular at the time. And I like watching this base, distinct visual style change and adapt over time to fit different scenarios. With that though, I also am ultimately okay with the gradual progression of how they have visually represented the vampires in the series. But it is a little disappointing to see them almost entirely abandon the blue eyes in this film. I think some of the creatures like Victor were so striking to look at in the previous entries, and to see them more or less all look very human by this point is a step back for me, especially considering that they use the blue eyes on the poster for the film. This poster is actually also odd, I think, because it promises a new, updated visual design for Celine that is only on screen for a few moments at the very end. She looks just like her old self for about 90% of this movie, and I would have liked to have seen this look introduced a little earlier in the film just to see more variation on display. Ultimately, and predictably, Celine is betrayed by her vampire partner midway through, and it is revealed that the whole training new death dealers was a massive ruse to get her to drop her guard so that the vampires could get revenge on her for killing Victor in the first film, because apparently they are still mad about that, even though it seems like there would be much more pressing things to worry about after an active genocide of their people and their number one enemy growing a massive army to come and kill the last of them that remain. Celine and David then escape and travel to seek asylum at a Nordic coven, and get involved in the battle against Marius, the new Lycan leader, which eventually leads them back to the main vampire coven to fight the final battle, which results in David and Celine being chosen as the new vampire elders. This is all okay. I don't have a lot to say on this except for the fact that it doesn't do a whole lot new with this universe. The section in the Nordic coven is great, I think, because we get some visuals that are very different from what we are accustomed to. But overall, I think Blood Wars shows that they didn't have any great ideas going into this. This feels like we're just going through the motions, and is the only movie in the series that feels stale to me, which is sad coming off of Awakening, which should have provided them with a lot of interesting new concepts to follow up on, which they do absolutely nothing with here. It is unfortunately just a pretty bad film that makes a lot of weird creative decisions and represents the Underworld franchise at its worst. Len Wiseman has talked in recent years about the prospect of bringing Underworld to television, which I think at this point would be a pretty good move. The one thing that I consistently really want from these movies is something that they can't really deliver, which is time. I want time to flesh out this world and mythology more, but each film has to tell its own story with its own character arc, while also having as much action as possible, and the history of this world and the mechanics and politics of how it all works always takes a back seat to that, leaving only hints to a greater whole. He said on the possibility of a future show set within this universe that, "I'm always trying to get something going, but one, I just want to make sure the quality is really good. There are a few things on Underworld we jumped right into. We did some action figures, we did some other things, and they were pretty bad. So I want to make sure that there's some quality control on it. I'd like to see that, and I'd like to see it branch into a television series as well. Just the two houses and the warring families, I think is really rich, and I'd like to see that go to cable and be as dark as it can be." And say what you will about the series, but I think there's a way to make that work for audiences still here in the 2020s. I really don't think that this franchise has yet reached the full potential that it could achieve creatively. And even though it probably won't happen, I would really like to see what it could do with at least a limited series run. I think there's a way to combine this over-the-top style action with underlying family politics that you actually have the proper time to develop in a meaningful way. I would bet money that this won't ever actually get made, but I think if it did, it would have a chance to at least do something very unique. I just don't think in practice many people would actually watch this if it were to get made. And that brings us up to today, in a weird place for this franchise, where some like Len Wiseman believing that a show or another movie could conceivably happen, with others like Kate Beckinsale confirming in September of 2018 that she never wants to make another one of these again, saying to Variety, "I wouldn't return, I've done plenty of those." It also doesn't help that one of the things that probably kept this going on for so long was Wiseman and Beckinsale's marriage that ended in 2019. And I can't pretend to know the dynamic there, but I can imagine that they wouldn't be too eager to get back to work together again this soon after a divorce. And with every star in the series either moving on to other things or being killed off in one of the films, if they were to move forward, it would be with a completely new set of people. And as I said, I don't really see that happening at this time. And you know, maybe that's for the best. When watching these, you get a particular feeling of an era that has long passed. These are a time capsule of the aesthetics of the Hot Topic 2000s in pretty much every way. And maybe it should remain like that, instead of reinventing itself and changing over time into a new thing that no longer resembles what it once was, that no longer has the same charm. I'm curious to see what happens here, or how these films are looked back on in the future. Pretty much every time you hear them mentioned today online, they are the subject of a joke. And you know what? Fair. But I think you can at least say that they are representative of an interesting time within the horror genre that showcase something that isn't done very often anymore. And more than anything, I hope they're remembered for that.
Na následným stranám. Programy má rád je. Sudá oko vás.